The air in the city was a thick, soupy thing, tasting of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. Liam's shoulders were permanently knotted, a testament to 60-hour work weeks and the incessant grinding pressure of a life he'd been told he wanted. Chloe felt it too, a different kind of weight. It was the weight of expectation, the silent hum of the apartment building, the feeling of being a ghost in a city of millions. They were drowning, slowly, in the noise and the ambition of it all. The cabin was meant to be their life raft, a 2-hour drive north, nestled in a forest so deep the listing photos showed nothing but a sea of green. It was an escape, a reset button, the place where the only deadline was the setting of the sun. When they finally saw it in person, the word that came to mind wasn't rustics or charming, it was stark. The cabin itself was fine, a solid-looking structure of dark timber, but the woods surrounding it were wrong. The trees were a uniform deathly gray, their branches skeletal and bare, clawing in a washed-out sky. There wasn't a single leaf in sight. Mr. Abernathy, the real estate agent, had a smile that seemed bolted to his face. "It's a petrified forest," he'd said, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "A local quirk? Geologically fascinating." He didn't meet their eyes when he said it. He was looking at the trees, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Liam, ever the pragmatist, bought the explanation. It was strange, sure, but it was also unique. Chloe felt a prickle of unease, a cold finger tracing its way down her spine. The silence was the first thing that truly hit them. Not quiet, but a deep, profound silence that seemed to swallow sound whole. It pressed in on them, a physical weight. But they were here. They had sunk their savings into this, and the city was a monster they had no intention of returning to. So they unpacked, a strange mix of excitement and trepidation coloring their movements. The cabin was larger inside than it looked, filled with the dusty ghosts of previous owners. The furniture was heavy and dark, the air thick with the smell of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic and sweet like old blood. In the main room, over the stone fireplace, hung a series of unsettling paintings. They depicted figures vaguely human, but their limbs were too long, their bodies stretched and distorted, as if seen through a warped lens. They were painted in muted grays and browns, blending into the background of a bleak, leafless forest. Chloe couldn't look at them for long. They made her feel seen. That night, as they lay in their new bed, the silence was broken. A faint, rhythmic tapping started on the walls. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate. Liam, ever the voice of reason, mumbled something about the house settling, a branch against the siding. But Chloe, her eyes wide in the darkness, knew it wasn't a branch. It was too rhythmic, too intentional. And underneath the tapping, almost too faint to hear, was another sound. A soft, sibilant whisper, like the wind, but there was no wind. It seemed to be coming from all around them, from the very walls of the cabin, and it sounded like it was calling their names. The first few days were a flurry of determined domesticity. They were building a new life, and that required effort. Liam tackled the practicalities, checking the generator, clearing the gutters, his movements crisp and efficient. Chloe took on the interior, scrubbing away layers of dust, trying to banish the lingering scent of decay. But the unease remained, a low hum beneath the surface of their new reality. The cabin felt less like a home and more like a stage, and they were the unwitting actors in a play they didn't understand. The unsettling artwork continued to dominate the main room, its distorted figures seeming to shift and writhe in the periphery of their vision. Chloe found herself avoiding the room altogether, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest whenever she passed the doorway. The silence of the woods was a constant, oppressive presence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature they had imagined. It was a dead silence, an absence of sound that felt unnatural. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered in the branches. The only sound was the wind, when it blew, whistling a mournful tune through the skeletal gray trees. In the basement, a damp, stone-walled space that smelled of earth and secrets, they found a locked door. It was made of heavy, dark wood, with a large, rusted iron lock. Mr. Abernathy, when they'd asked, had claimed to have no key. Probably just an old coal chute, he'd said with a dismissive wave of his hand. But the door didn't look like it led to a coal chute. It looked like it was meant to keep something in. Liam, his curiosity piqued, jiggled the lock, but it was solid. He promised to come back with a crowbar. Chloe hoped he wouldn't. She didn't want to know what was behind that door. She felt a growing certainty that some things were better left undisturbed. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was a constant, prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of unseen eyes following her every move. One afternoon, while taking a walk to map the edge of their property, she noticed something that made her stop dead. The trees, the strange, leafless gray trees, formed a perfect, unbroken circle around the cabin. It was too perfect to be natural. It was a border, a fence made of dead wood. As she got closer to one of the trees, she saw deep, angry-looking scratches in the bark. They were long and jagged, as if made by something with immense claws. Liam, when she told him, offered a dozen logical explanations. The circular clearing was a coincidence, a geological anomaly. The scratches were from a bear or a mountain lion. He was trying to soothe her, but his words felt hollow, his rationalizations increasingly strained. He was trying to convince himself as much as her. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time, more insistent, and the whispers were clearer, weaving their way through the cracks in the walls, slithering into their dreams. They promised release, an end to the gnawing anxiety that had followed them from the city. They promised peace. And as Chloe lay awake, her heart pounding in her chest, she had a terrifying thought. What if, on some level, she wanted to listen? The feeling of being watched was no longer a subtle prickle. It was a suffocating weight. Chloe found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her gaze darting to the windows, expecting to see a face staring back. The woods, which were meant to be their sanctuary, had become a source of ever-present dread. Gray, skeletal trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches like grasping fingers, their very presence a violation of the natural order. She tried to focus on the small things, the mundane tasks of setting up a home, but the oppressive atmosphere of the place seeped into everything. Even the sunlight seemed to struggle to penetrate the thick canopy of bare branches, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed at the edge of her vision. One afternoon, she decided to walk the perimeter of the property again, a futile attempt to reclaim some sense of control. As she traced the perfect, unnatural circle of the trees, she ran her hand over the rough, cold bark. The deep, angry scratches were everywhere, on almost every tree. They weren't random. They were deliberate, a message she couldn't decipher. It was then that she saw him, a figure standing at the edge of the woods just beyond the tree line. He was old, his face a road map of wrinkles, his clothes worn and faded. He was just standing there, watching her. When their eyes met, he didn't smile or wave. He just stared, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run, to scream, but she was frozen to the spot. After a long, agonizing moment, the old man turned and shuffled away, disappearing back into the gray depths of the forest. Liam was dismissive when she told him. "Probably just a hunter," he said, his voice tight. "Or a hiker. It's a national forest, Chloe. We're not the only people out here." But his eyes betrayed his unease. He, too, had felt the wrongness of the place. The suffocating silence, the persistent feeling of being an intruder in a land that did not want them. He was just better at lying to himself. That night, the whispers grew bolder. They were no longer faint, sibilant hisses. They were clear, distinct voices, calling their names from the darkness. "Liam!" "Chloe, come out. We've been waiting." It's Liam, his face pale and drawn, cranked up the generator, the loud hum, a welcome distraction from the insidious voices. He put on music, the familiar melodies, a fragile shield against the encroaching dread. But the whispers were still there, a venomous undercurrent beneath the noise. They were inside his head now, and he couldn't escape them. Chloe, huddled under a blanket on the sofa, rocked back and forth, her hands pressed over her ears. She could feel the cabin shrinking around them, the walls closing in. The woods were no longer just outside. They were inside, in their minds, in their fears. And they were hungry. Their only connection to the outside world was a single winding dirt road that snaked its way through the oppressive gray forest. A few days after Chloe's unsettling encounter, they were running low on supplies, a fact that filled them both with a strange mixture of dread and relief. The thought of leaving the cabin, even for a few hours, was terrifying. But the thought of staying, of being completely cut off, was even worse. As they drove, the skeletal trees seemed to press in on the car, their branches like grasping claws. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of gravel under their tires. About a mile down the road, they saw a thin plume of smoke rising from a small, dilapidated shack set back from the road. It was the home of the old man Chloe had seen at the edge of the woods. His name, they would soon learn, was Elias. He was sitting on his porch, a shotgun resting across his lap, his eyes narrowed with suspicion as they pulled up. He was not a welcoming man. His face was a mask of grim resignation, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You're the new folks," he said, his gaze flicking between Liam and Chloe. It wasn't a question. The ones who bought the Abernathy place. Liam, trying to force a friendly tone, explained that they were on their way to town for supplies. Elias just grunted in response. "Should have stayed in the city," he muttered, his eyes drifting towards the woods that surrounded his own small clearing. "This ain't no place for people like you." Chloe, her voice barely a whisper, asked him about the trees, about why they were all bare. A shadow passed over Elias's face, a deep, ancient fear. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and his expression softened for a fraction of a second. "Some things are best left alone," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You listen to me? You don't go into those woods, you hear me? Not for any reason. And you never, ever stay out after dark." He leaned forward then, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And if you hear the whispers, you don't listen. You block 'em out. You understand? They'll promise you things you think you want, but it's a lie. It's all a lie." He seemed particularly disturbed when they mentioned the cabin, the strange artwork, the locked room in the basement. He shook his head, a look of profound sadness in his eyes. "That place," he started, then trailed off, his gaze lost in the distance. He muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like pact. Before they could ask him what he meant, he stood up, his movements stiff and pained. "You best be on your way," he said, his voice once again hard and dismissive, "and you best be back before sundown." As they drove away, a heavy silence filled the car. Elias's words, cryptic and terrifying, hung in the air between them. The trip to town, which should have been a welcome respite, was now fraught with a new and terrible urgency. The sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, and the shadows of the leafless trees were growing long and distorted, like grasping fingers reaching out to pull them back into the darkness. The first night was a descent into a new kind of fear. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised purple twilight that seemed to cling to the gray, skeletal trees. The silence of the woods deepened, becoming a living, breathing entity that pressed in on the small cabin from all sides. They had made it back from town just as the last sliver of light disappeared, the oppressive darkness of the forest swallowing the dirt road behind them. Elias's warnings echoed in their minds, each cryptic phrase a seed of terror taking root. They ate in silence, the food tasteless in their mouths. Every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind that rattled the window panes, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through their already frayed nerves. Liam, in a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, lit a fire in the hearth. The flames cast dancing, distorted shadows on the walls, making the elongated figures in the paintings seem to writhe and twist in the flickering light. Chloe couldn't bear to look at them. She felt their painted eyes following her, their silent judgment, a palpable weight in the room. Around 9 o'clock, the tapping started. It was different this time. Not the slow, deliberate rhythm of the previous nights, but a frantic, desperate scratching, as if some small, terrified animal was trying to claw its way in. It came from all directions at once, the walls, the roof, the floorboards beneath their feet. And then came the whispers. They were no longer just calling their names, they were weaving intricate, seductive lies, their voices a venomous symphony of temptation. They spoke of Liam's failures, the crushing weight of his ambition, the gnawing fear that he was not enough. They spoke of Chloe's loneliness, her secret grief over a past she had never shared with him, the hollow ache in her heart that the city had carved out. The whispers promised to take it all away. They promised peace, a quiet, dreamless sleep from which they would never have to wake. Liam, his face a mask of grim determination, turned up the music on his phone, the tinny speakers a pathetic defense against the insidious onslaught. But the whispers were not just in the air. They were inside his head, his own doubts and fears twisted into a weapon against him. Chloe, huddled on the sofa, her hands pressed tight against her ears, began to sob, her body shaking with a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. Later, much later, in the dead of night, she had a dream. She was standing at the edge of the woods, the gray, leafless trees, a stark, silent army before her. Shadowy figures, their forms indistinct and constantly shifting, moved between the trees, their movements fluid and unnatural. They were watching her, their presence a cold, malevolent weight. One of the figures detached itself from the others and drifted towards her, its form coalescing into something vaguely human, but its limbs were too long, its body stretched and distorted, just like the figures in the paintings. It reached out a long, skeletal hand and whispered her name. Chloe woke up with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the whisper still echoing in the suffocating darkness of the room. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was cold. The tapping had stopped. The whispers had ceased. But the silence that remained was somehow even more terrifying. It was the silence of a predator, waiting patiently for its prey to make a mistake. The locked room in the basement became an obsession for Liam. It was a tangible mystery in a world that was rapidly dissolving into a nightmare of whispers and shadows. He saw it as a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be unlocked. If he could just figure out what was behind that door, maybe, just maybe, he could start to make sense of the madness that was closing in on them. Chloe, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with it. The basement, with its damp, earthy smell and its oppressive subterranean darkness, filled her with a primal dread. The locked door, in her mind, was a boundary, a line that should not be crossed. "Let's just leave it, Liam," she pleaded, her voice thin and strained. "Please, some things are better left alone." But Liam was not to be deterred. His pragmatism, his need for logical explanations, was a shield against the encroaching fear, and that shield was beginning to crack. He needed this one small victory against the encroaching chaos. He found a crowbar in the small shed behind the cabin, the rusted metal cold and heavy in his hands. As he descended the rickety wooden stairs into the basement, the air grew colder, the silence more profound. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock his every move. The lock on the door was old and stubborn, but Liam was fueled by a desperate, almost manic energy. He wedged the crowbar into the frame and pulled, his muscles straining, the wood groaning in protest. With a final splintering crack, the door flew open, revealing a small, windowless room, the air inside thick with the smell of dust and decay. The room was empty, save for a small wooden desk and a single straight-backed chair. On the desk, there was a stack of old, leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. Liam reached for the top journal, his hand trembling slightly. He opened it, and a cloud of dust motes danced in the dim light. The handwriting inside was a frantic, spidery scrawl. The ink faded and blurred in places. It was the journal of a man who was clearly losing his mind. He wrote of a silent god in the woods, a keeper of the gray, an ancient, malevolent entity that fed on life and vitality. He wrote of a pact, a terrible bargain made by the original settlers of this land, a sacrifice to keep the entity dormant. He wrote of the whispers, the seductive lies that promised peace but delivered only madness. And he wrote of a ritual, a desperate last-ditch effort to reinforce the cabin's protection, a ritual that required a terrible price. As Liam read, a cold, creeping dread washed over him. This was not the journal of a madman. It was a warning, a testament to a horror that had played out in this very cabin perhaps many times before. The final entry in the journal was a single chilling sentence, the handwriting barely legible, as if written by a hand shaking with terror. "It wants in." Liam looked up from the journal, his eyes wide with a new and terrible understanding. The tapping on the walls, the whispers in the dark, the feeling of being watched, it was all real, and they were not the first to experience it. They were just the latest victims in a long and terrifying cycle. He closed the journal, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had wanted answers, and now he had them, and they were far, far worse than anything he could have ever imagined. The discovery of the journals changed everything. The fragile veil of denial that Liam had clung to was ripped away, leaving him exposed and terrified. The whispers were no longer just a symptom of stress or isolation. They were the voice of a real and present danger, and they were getting louder. They were no longer confined to the night. They were a constant, insidious presence, a venomous undercurrent of the suffocating silence of the woods. They followed them from room to room, their seductive promises of peace and release a constant temptation. Chloe found herself drawn to them, a moth to a flame. The whispers spoke to the deepest, most secret parts of her heart, the loneliness and grief that she had carried for so long. They promised an end to the pain, a quiet, dreamless oblivion that was becoming more and more appealing. She would stand at the window for hours, her gaze fixed on the gray, skeletal trees, a strange, vacant expression on her face. Liam would have to physically pull her away, his own fear a sharp, bitter taste in his mouth. He, too, heard the whispers, but they spoke to him of failure, of his inability to protect his wife, of the crushing weight of his own inadequacies. He fought against them, his rational mind a fortress under siege. But the whispers were patient. They knew his weaknesses, his fears, his secret shames, and they used them against him with a chilling precision. Their dog, Buster, a scruffy terrier mix who had been their constant companion for years, had been agitated since the moment they arrived. He would pace restlessly, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the woods. He refused to go outside, even to relieve himself, a fact that added to their growing sense of unease. One morning, Buster was gone. The back door, which they had been so careful to keep locked and bolted, was slightly ajar. A single muddy paw print on the kitchen floor was the only sign that he had been there at all. They searched for him for hours, their frantic calls echoing in the dead silence of the woods. They pushed past the perfect, unnatural circle of trees, their fear for their pet overriding the terror that the woods inspired, but it was hopeless. The forest was a gray, featureless maze, every tree identical to the last. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows, Chloe stumbled upon something that made her cry out in horror. Near the edge of the property line, just beyond the circle of bare trees, was a single bloody paw print, stark and red against the gray, barren earth. There was no other sign of Buster. No body, no tracks, nothing. It was as if he had simply been erased from existence. The sight of that single bloody paw print broke something inside of Liam. The last vestiges of his skepticism crumbled into dust, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The entity in the woods, the keeper of the gray, was not just a psychological threat. It was a physical one. And it had just taken their dog. As they stumbled back to the cabin, the whispers seemed to mock them, their sibilant voices filled with a triumphant, malevolent glee. They had taken something from them, a small, innocent life, and they were reveling in their victory. That night, there was no pretense of normalcy. They huddled together in the living room, the doors and windows bolted, a small, flickering lamp, their only defense against the encroaching darkness. The whispers were louder than ever, a chorus of damnation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. And for the first time, Liam and Chloe whispered back, not in acceptance, but in defiance. A desperate, futile act of rebellion against a power they could not begin to comprehend. But the whispers only laughed, their voices a cold, cruel wind that extinguished the last flickering embers of their hope. The disappearance of Buster was a turning point. The horror was no longer a creeping, atmospheric dread. It was a tangible, immediate threat. Liam, his face a pale, drawn mask of terror, knew that he couldn't fight this alone. He needed help. He needed answers. And there was only one person who might have them, Elias. The next morning, under a sky the color of old bruises, Liam left a sleeping Chloe in the cabin and made the mile-long trek to the old man's shack. The woods were even more menacing in the dim morning light, the gray, skeletal trees like the bones of some long-dead leviathan. He found Elias on his porch, the ever-present shotgun resting across his lap. The old man didn't seem surprised to see him. He just nodded slowly, a look of profound sadness in his eyes. "The dog," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. Liam just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Elias sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "It started," he said, his gaze fixed on the oppressive gray forest that surrounded his own small clearing. "Once it gets a taste, it always wants more." He invited Liam inside, his small shack a cluttered, chaotic space that smelled of wood smoke and unwashed linen. He poured them both a glass of cheap whiskey, the amber liquid a welcome warmth against the cold dread that had taken root in Liam's gut. And then he told him the story. A story that had been passed down through generations, a story that was as much a part of this land as the rocks and the trees. The woods, he explained, were a prison, a cage for an ancient, powerful entity that had existed long before the first humans set foot on this continent. It was a thing of hunger and emptiness, a keeper of the gray that fed on life, on vitality, on the very essence of what it meant to be alive. The first settlers, he said, had stumbled upon this place, drawn by its strange, desolate beauty. They had tried to tame it, to build a life here, but the entity would not allow it. It tormented them, drove them mad until they were on the brink of annihilation. And so they made a pact, a terrible, desperate bargain. They offered the entity a sacrifice, not of blood, but of life itself. They severed their connection to the green world, to the vibrant, living pulse of the earth. In exchange for their own lives, they condemned the forest to a state of perpetual death. The bare gray trees were the result of that pact, a stark, silent monument to a deal made with the devil. The entity, in return, would remain dormant as long as the pact was honored. But the pact was fragile. It could be broken, and the cabin, he explained, was the key. It was built on the very spot where the pact was made, a place of power, a fulcrum between the world of the living and the world of the gray. It was meant to be a seal, a lock on the prison, but over the years its power had weakened, and the entity was stirring in its sleep. "It's waking up, boy," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "And it's hungry." He looked at Liam then, his eyes filled with a terrible, ancient wisdom. "And you and your woman, you're like a feast laid out before a starving man." Elias's story settled in Liam's gut like a stone. The mad ramblings in the journal, the whispers, the leafless trees. It all clicked into place, forming a picture of a horror so vast and ancient it was almost incomprehensible. The entity, this keeper of the gray, wasn't just a monster. It was a fundamental force of this place, a god of emptiness, and it fed on life. Not just the physical body, but the emotional energy, the spark of vitality that animated them, their stress, their fear, their desperate hope for a new beginning. It was all a banquet for the thing in the woods. "It's drawn to strong emotions," Elias explained, his voice a low, grim murmur. "The more you feel, the more you fight, the brighter you burn. And the brighter you burn, the easier you are to see." "The whispers," he said, "were its lure. A carefully crafted illusion, tailored to the specific fears and desires of its victims. It was a spider, and the whispers were its web." "The cabin is the only place you're safe," Elias continued, his gaze distant. "The pact was made there. Its power still lingers. But it's weakening. The walls are getting thin." He told Liam that the previous owners, the ones who had left the journals, had tried to fight it. They had tried to break the pact, to bring life back to the forest. They had failed. And in their failure, they had only made the entity stronger. "You can't fight it, boy," Elias warned, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "You can't reason with it. You can't hope to understand it. All you can do is hide and pray that it doesn't find a way in." He explained that the entity's influence was strongest at night, when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. He told him to board up the windows, to ignore the whispers, to never, ever open the door after dark, no matter what they heard. "It can mimic sounds," he said, his eyes wide with a remembered terror. "It can sound like a lost child, a woman screaming for help. It can even sound like someone you know." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It took my wife," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that was decades old but still raw. "She heard our daughter crying in the woods. Our daughter, who had been dead for 10 years. As Liam stumbled back to the cabin, the woods seemed to watch him with a new and terrible intelligence. The gray, skeletal trees were no longer just trees. They were the bars of a cage, and he and Chloe were trapped inside with the monster. He found her in the living room, staring at the unsettling paintings on the wall, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. "I know what they are," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The paintings. They're not just figures. They're the trees." Liam looked closer, and a fresh wave of horror washed over him. She was right. The elongated, distorted limbs, the twisted, writhing bodies, they were the branches of the great trees, contorted into a grotesque mockery of the human form. And in the background of one of the paintings, almost hidden in the muted gray landscape, was a faint depiction of the cabin. And in the doorway, 2 small, shadowy figures stood, their forms indistinct and featureless. It was a portrait of them, a prophecy of their own damnation. While Liam was with Elias, Chloe had been drawn back to the paintings. She couldn't explain why. It was as if they were calling to her, their silent painted screams, a siren song of dread. She had spent hours staring at them, her mind a numb, buzzing void, and then she had seen it, a detail she had missed before, a small, almost insignificant brushstroke that changed everything. In the largest of the paintings, the one that depicted a writhing mass of tree-like figures, there was a tiny, almost imperceptible detail in the background, a faint, ghostly image of the cabin, and in the doorway of the painted cabin 2 small, shadowy figures. It was them. She knew it with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the stone of the fireplace. The painting wasn't just a depiction of a nightmare, it was a premonition, a prophecy. When Liam returned, his face a mask of grim terror, she didn't need him to tell her what he had learned. She could see it in his eyes. The truth. The terrible, incomprehensible truth. They were not just in a house in the woods, they were in a prison, a feeding ground, and they were the prey. Together they went back to the journals, Elias's warnings and Chloe's discovery casting the madman's words in a new and terrifying light. The spidery scrawl was no longer the ramblings of a lunatic. It was a desperate, first-hand account of a man's descent into a living hell. He wrote of the entity, the keeper of the gray, with a chilling, intimate familiarity. He described its whispers, its promises, its relentless, soul-crushing pressure. He wrote of the pact, the terrible bargain that had created this dead gray world. And he wrote of his own desperate, foolish attempt to break it. He had tried to bring life back to the forest, to plant seeds in the barren, gray earth. He had tried to fight the entity, to push back against the encroaching emptiness. But he had failed, and in his failure, he had only made it stronger. The journals described his descent into madness with a chilling, clinical precision. The loss of time, the paranoia, the auditory and visual hallucinations. He wrote of seeing the trees move, their branches twisting into grotesque, humanoid shapes. He wrote of the faces he saw in the wood grain of the cabin walls, their mouths open in silent screams. He wrote of his wife, who had succumbed to the whispers, who had walked out into the woods one night and never returned. The final entry was dated almost a year after the first. The handwriting was almost illegible, the words a desperate final plea. "It's in the walls, it's in the floor, it's in my head, I can't get it out. It wants in, it wants in, it wants in, it wants in." Liam closed the journal, his hands shaking. The previous owner hadn't just gone mad, he had been consumed, devoured, and the entity was still here, still hungry. And now it wanted them. As if on cue, the tapping started. Not the frantic scratching of the previous nights, but a slow, deliberate, rhythmic pounding. It was coming from the walls, the roof, the floorboards. It was the sound of a giant, malevolent heart beating in the darkness, and it was getting closer. The tapping was no longer just a sound. It was a physical presence, a relentless, percussive assault that vibrated through the very bones of the cabin. It was the sound of the trees, their skeletal branches drumming against the walls, a monstrous, arboreal orchestra of terror. It was constant, a maddening, inescapable rhythm that frayed their already shattered nerves. Sleep was impossible. Every time they closed their eyes, the tapping seemed to grow louder, more insistent, a physical manifestation of the entity's relentless, suffocating pressure. They were living in a drum, and the monster was beating on the outside. The whispers, too, had changed. They were no longer seductive or tempting. They were guttural, angry, a chorus of pure, undiluted malice. They hissed and spat from the shadows, their voices a venomous symphony of hatred. They spoke of rot and decay, of the sweet, slow pleasure of dissolution. They described in chilling detail what they were going to do to them when they finally got in. Liam and Chloe moved through the cabin like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with a terror that was rapidly consuming them. They spoke in hushed whispers, as if afraid the entity would overhear their plans, their pathetic, futile attempts to survive. They boarded up the windows, nailing thick planks of wood over the glass, plunging the cabin into a perpetual claustrophobic twilight. But it did nothing to stop the tapping. If anything, it made it worse. The darkness seemed to amplify the sound, to give it a new and terrible resonance. They were trapped in a coffin, and the sound was the dirt being shoveled on top. Their relationship, once their only source of comfort and strength, began to crumble under the strain. The fear was a corrosive acid, eating away at the bonds of love and trust that had once united them. They snapped at each other, their words sharp and cruel, their accusations born of a terror so profound it had to be directed at someone, anyone. Liam, his pragmatism shattered, became obsessed with the journals, with the ritual the previous owner had described. He saw it as their only hope, a desperate last-ditch gamble to save themselves. Chloe, however, saw it as a fool's errand, a dangerous, reckless act that would only make things worse. "It's a trap, Liam," she pleaded, her voice hoarse from a combination of screaming and crying. "Can't you see that? It's what it wants us to do." But Liam was no longer listening to her. He was listening to the whispers, to the desperate, seductive promise of a way out. He was a drowning man, and the ritual was the only straw he had left to grasp. The siege was relentless, a slow, grinding war of attrition that was designed to break them down, to strip them of their sanity, their hope, their very will to live. The cabin, their supposed sanctuary, had become their prison, and the walls were closing in. The cabin had become a tomb. The boarded-up windows plunged them into a perpetual, suffocating twilight, the air thick with the smell of fear and despair. The relentless, rhythmic tapping of the trees was a constant, maddening drumbeat, a countdown to their inevitable doom. The whispers were a venomous chorus, a symphony of malice that echoed in the claustrophobic darkness. They were under siege, and their defenses, both physical and psychological, were crumbling. Liam, his eyes wild with a desperate, manic energy, was a man possessed. He had become convinced that the ritual described in the journals was their only way out. He ignored Chloe's pleas, her warnings, her desperate, tearful attempts to make him see reason. He was deaf to everything but the whispers and the frantic, terrified beating of his own heart. He spent his days poring over the journals, his finger tracing the spidery, insane scrawl, his lips moving silently as he memorized the strange, guttural words of the ritual. He gathered the ingredients, a bizarre and unsettling collection of objects that seemed to have no logical connection to each other. Dried herbs that he found in the back of a kitchen cupboard, their scent cloying and sweet. A handful of smooth, black stones that he collected from the nearby creek, the water so cold it felt like it was burning his skin. And a personal item of great sentimental value. He chose the small silver locket that Chloe had given him on their first anniversary, the one that contained a tiny faded photograph of the two of them, smiling and happy in a world that no longer seemed to exist. Chloe watched him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She saw the madness in his eyes, the same madness that she had read about in the journals. He was following the same path as the previous owner, a path that led only to destruction. "Don't do this, Lamb," she begged, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Please, it's what it wants. It's a trap." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and contempt. "You don't understand, Chloe," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is the only way. We have to fight back. We have to show it that we're not afraid." But he was afraid. She could see it in the tremor of his hands and the sweat that beaded on his forehead and the frantic, desperate energy that radiated from him. He was terrified, and his fear was making him reckless. That night, as a storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing against the boarded-up windows, Liam descended into the basement. He carried with him the herbs, the stones, and the locket. And in his mind, he carried the words of the ritual, a dark and terrible prayer to a god he did not understand. Chloe remained upstairs, huddled in the living room, a silent, helpless witness to her husband's descent into madness. She could hear him moving around in the basement, his footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. She could hear him chanting, his voice a low, guttural monotone, the strange alien words of the ritual, a terrifying counterpoint to the fury of the storm. And then she heard something else, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. The cabin shook violently, the wooden beams groaning in protest. The tapping stopped, the whispers ceased. And in the profound, unnerving silence that followed, Chloe knew, with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass, that Liam had not saved them. He had damned them. The silence that followed the ritual was more terrifying than any sound. It was a dead, empty silence, a void where the relentless tapping and the venomous whispers had once been. It was the silence of a predator that has stopped toying with its prey and is now moving in for the kill. The cabin, which had been shaking violently, was now unnervingly still. The storm outside had ceased, the wind and the rain silenced as if a switch had been flipped. Liam, his face a mask of triumphant disbelief, stumbled up the basement stairs. "It worked," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Chloe, it worked. It's gone." But Chloe knew better. She could feel it, a cold, malevolent presence that was no longer just outside the cabin, but inside. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air they breathed. The ritual had not banished it. It had invited it in. A low, guttural growl echoed through the cabin, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. It was a sound of ancient hunger, of a power that had been constrained for centuries and was now, finally, free. The floorboards began to tremble, the wooden beams groaning under an immense, unseen weight. The paintings on the wall began to shake, the distorted tree-like figures seeming to writhe in their frames. And then the front door, which they had bolted and barricaded, splintered and burst inwards, the wood exploding into a shower of jagged shards. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the oppressive pre-dawn gloom. It was tall and gaunt, its form vaguely humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its body stretched and distorted, just like the figures in the paintings. It was made of gnarled gray wood, its surface a writhing mass of twisted branches and roots. Its face was a featureless expanse of bark, but two burning, malevolent embers glowed where its eyes should have been. It was the Keeper of the Gray, and it was beautiful in a terrible, awe-inspiring way. It was the embodiment of the woods, of the ancient, hungry emptiness that had surrounded them for weeks. It was a god of decay, a monument to the slow, inexorable power of entropy. It took a step into the room, its movements jerky and unnatural, the sound of grinding wood and snapping twigs accompanying its every move. It turned its head, its burning eyes fixing on Chloe, and she felt a cold, paralyzing terror wash over her. This was it. The end. The final, terrifying confrontation with the monster that had been haunting their every waking moment. Liam, his face a mask of horrified disbelief, stood frozen, the terrible, soul-crushing weight of his mistake crashing down on him. He had not saved them. He had delivered them unto their doom. The creature raised a long, skeletal arm, its fingers a cluster of sharp, pointed twigs. It pointed at Chloe, and a low, rumbling sound, like the grinding of stones, emanated from its chest. It was a sound of hunger, a sound of anticipation, a sound of damnation. The creature, the Keeper of the Gray, was a walking nightmare, a grotesque mockery of life forged from the dead wood of the forest. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, its burning, ember-like eyes fixed on Chloe. She was paralyzed, her mind a screaming, white-hot void of terror. She could feel its hunger, a palpable force that seemed to be drawing the very life out of her, the warmth from her skin, the air from her lungs. Liam, who had been frozen in a state of horrified disbelief, was jolted into action by the sheer, primal terror in Chloe's eyes. The full, crushing weight of his mistake, of his arrogant, desperate gamble crashed down on him. He had done this. He had invited this thing into their home. He had condemned the woman he loved to a fate worse than death. In that moment, something inside him broke. The fear, the guilt, the self-loathing, it all coalesced into a single, desperate, selfless act. He had to save her. It was the only thing that mattered. With a guttural cry that was more animal than human, he ran towards the creature, placing himself directly between it and Chloe. "No!" he screamed, his voice raw with a desperate, suicidal courage. "Take me. It's me you want. I'm the one who broke the pact. I'm the one who called you." The creature paused, its head tilting to the side, a gesture of mild curiosity. Its burning eyes shifted from Chloe to Liam, and for a moment the three of them were frozen in a silent, terrifying tableau. Liam could feel the creature's attention on him, a cold, analytical pressure that seemed to be peeling back the layers of his soul, weighing his fear, his guilt, his love for the woman who stood trembling behind him. He had made a new offering, a new sacrifice, himself. The creature seemed to consider his offer, its featureless face a mask of inscrutable, ancient intelligence. Then it raised its long, skeletal arm and pointed at Liam. The low, rumbling sound emanated from its chest again, a sound of acceptance. It took a step towards him, its jerky, unnatural movements, a grotesque parody of a walk. Liam stood his ground, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind a strange, calm oasis in a storm of terror. He had made his choice. He had accepted his fate. He looked at Chloe, his eyes filled with a love and a regret so profound it was almost unbearable. "I love you," he mouthed, the words a silent, final farewell. And then he turned his back on her and ran. He ran out of the splintered doorway, out into the gray, pre-dawn gloom of the forest. He didn't look back. He just ran, his desperate, ragged breaths a stark counterpoint to the dead silence of the woods. The creature hesitated for a fraction of a second, its burning eyes flicking back to Chloe, as if considering its options. Then, with a final low growl, it turned and followed him, its massive wooden form crashing through the underbrush, the sound of its pursuit a thunderous, terrifying roar that echoed through the silent, gray forest. Chloe was alone. The last thing she saw before she collapsed into a black, merciful unconsciousness was the sight of her husband, her Liam, disappearing into the maw of the dead, gray woods, a willing sacrifice to a god he had woken from its long and terrible slumber. Days later, a park ranger, following up on a missed check-in call from a concerned family member, found the cabin. The front door was a splintered ruin, the interior a scene of chaos and neglect. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, and a strange, unsettling silence that seemed to swallow sound whole. He found Chloe wandering on the dirt road a few miles away, her clothes torn, her face a blank, emotionless mask. She was suffering from exposure, dehydration, and a profound catatonic shock. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even seem to comprehend where she was or what had happened to her. She was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of the woman she had once been. Of Liam, there was no sign. The ranger, a man who had worked in these woods for 30 years, organized a search party. They scoured the forest for a week, their bright orange vests a stark, jarring contrast to the muted gray landscape. They found nothing. No tracks, no body, no sign of a struggle. It was as if Liam had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The official report listed him as a missing person, presumed to have succumbed to the elements. But the ranger, a man who knew the strange, unsettling history of these woods, knew better. He had seen things, heard things that he couldn't explain. He knew that some places were best left alone. And this dead gray forest was one of them. Chloe was taken to a hospital where she slowly, painstakingly, began to recover. Physically, at least. Mentally, she was a ruin. She never spoke of what happened in the cabin. She couldn't. The memories were locked away in a dark, inaccessible corner of her mind, a place she was too terrified to ever visit again. The cabin was eventually sold again to another couple from the city, another pair of hopeful, desperate souls seeking an escape from the noise and the pressure of their lives. Mr. Abernathy, his smile as fixed and cheerful as ever, told them that the previous owners had simply changed their minds, that the isolation wasn't for them. He didn't mention the missing husband, he didn't mention the catatonic wife, and he certainly didn't mention the strange, unsettling paintings that still hung on the walls of the main room. But there was a new painting now, a small, unassuming canvas that had not been there before. It was tucked away in a corner, almost hidden in the shadows. It depicted a single, leafless tree, its branches like grasping claws. And standing beneath it, a lone, shadowy figure, its form indistinct and featureless, its presence a silent, eternal testament to the pact that had been broken and the price that had been paid. The woods were silent once more. The keeper of the gray was dormant, sated for now. But it was patient. It had all the time in the world. And it was always hungry,